be sharing with you how to make the Atelier Joy kimono jacket. This is the short version, and I'm specifically going to be showing you how to make a lined version. This has a contrast collar and contrast cuff. It has a faced hem that you can either do in your main fabric or in a contrast fabric. And as you can see, it's fully lined. There's also the option to make this in a longer version that hits at the hip, and you can put patch pockets on that longer version. I'm using a linen fabric for the main fabric and for the cuffs and collar, and a polyester lining for the interior. There are two size options for this. This is the Mrs. size option. There's also the plus size option. You can find this and my other patterns on Atelier Joy on Etsy. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Thanks for watching. We're going to start by stay stitching this back collar neckline, because eventually we'll be clipping into these curves to stitch it to the straight collar. So I'm going to stay stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to actually adjust my stitch length down to 2 since we're stay stitching. And here we go. Okay, the next step is going to be to do our shoulder seams on the lining between the front and back panels. And for my lining fabric, I don't have a right or wrong side. They're both the same. But if you did have lining that had a right and wrong side, you would be pinning and sewing right side to right side. All right, so what you want to do is lay out your back panel, and you'll notice that you have double notches close to the back neckline, and then out a little bit further you have a single notch right here closer to the armhole. So those are the notches that you're going to be lining up for your front panels. So here I've got a front panel with a double notch here and a single notch here, so I'm going to put this on this side. And you want to line up the notches and pin it in place. All right, we're going to stitch our shoulder seams now with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I have readjusted my stitch length. I'm no longer doing the stay stitching, so I've set it back to like a 3.5. And now I'm going to stitch these shoulder seams with 5/8 inch seam allowance. All right, now I'm going to press open this shoulder seam allowance. If you want to, you can pink these seams, but since it's all going to be contained inside the garment, I'm not going to bother finishing the seams in any way. And make sure that you've got your iron set up for the fabric content that you're using. So like I said, this is a polyester lining that I'm using. So I had to turn down my iron. I'm actually going to turn it down a little bit more to synthetics, otherwise you're going to melt your polyester if that's what you're using. And just press that open. The next part, we can move this to the side, is to get our sleeves stitched, our underarm seam for our sleeves stitched. So I've got my 2 sleeves here. Take one of them And what you want to do is pin together the shorter edges. And also these are the edges that do not have notches. So the long edges, you'll see one side has a single notch and then the other side has a double notch. That's where you're going to be attaching the shoulder seam of the garment and the cuff. So that's not what we're stitching right now. We're stitching up this shorter seam. And again, if you have a right and wrong side, you'll be pinning and stitching right side to right side. Okay, so that's one sleeve, and now I'm going to do the other one. Okay, we're stitching with a 5/8 inch seam allowance again. We've got our underarm seams sewn for both sleeves, and now we need to press open that seam allowance. So I recommend using a seam roll if you have one. And with your sleeves still inside out, you're going to push that seam roll in there and lay the seam on top of it. And then open this up. All right, so now we're going to be inserting the sleeve into the body and stitching that side seam afterwards. So what you want to do is we're going to be pinning the sleeve to the body right side to right side. So that means we need to turn this sleeve right side out. So go ahead and do that. And then opposite of this underarm sleeve, don't mind my water stains, you're going to see there's notches. There's a single notch here and there's a double notch here. The double notch is for attaching the cuff. The single notch is for attaching the shoulder seam. So you want to take that single notch, you're gonna fold back this and match up that single notch to your shoulder seam. There you go. I've got that matched up. And then when you pin it in place, you want to make sure that you're pinning this seam allowance, this shoulder seam allowance open, so that when you stitch, it'll be stitched flat. So go ahead and pin that in place. Okay, and then you're going to be pinning the sleeve to the back side. So this is my back panel, and you'll see I have my back neckline here, and I have a single notch down here. That's where I match up my underarm seam to. So you can go ahead and pin the center of your underarm seam right there. And then we can pin everything in between the shoulder seam and that underarm seam. So that's attaching it to the back panel. Now we're going to attach it to this front panel. So again, I'm going to find my notch on my front panel that matches to the underarm seam. And I'm going to line that up with this sleeve underarm seam and pin it in place. And then I pin in place everything between those, between the shoulder seam and the underarm seam. And then you're going to do that same thing for the other sleeve. This sewing step where we're sewing the sleeve to the body is probably the trickiest step, so don't fret. It's gonna be fine, just take it slow. So what you're gonna be doing is you're gonna be stitching around the entire sleeve, but you're gonna be starting and ending at the underarm seam. And you're gonna be very careful to start and end exactly at that seam because we don't want to accidentally stitch extra fabric to it. So I'm going to start and I'm stitching with the sleeve facing up toward me. And I am starting with the back portion of the sleeve. I'm gonna feed this in here with that underarm seam of the sleeve and line it up with my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then line up my needle right at that seam. Okay, and make sure that you've got the rest of your seam allowances pulled out from behind, okay? And then you're going to carefully do a couple of back stitches. You can even do this by hand crank, just to make sure you don't go over. Right back into that seam, and then stitch all the way around. I'm getting close to my shoulder seam, and you can see it was kind of tucked under like that. I want to go in there and make sure that this shoulder seam is flat. So when I stitch, it's nice and flat. So you want to make sure you've got your body panel pulled out straight here, and that the other body panel is pulled out away too. And now, just like we started with, we're going to stitch right up to this seam and do a couple of careful back stitches and end right at that seam. I'm hand cranking now. I'm gonna actually lift my presser foot up and just go right into that seam. And now I'm going to hand crank a couple of back stitches and finish up right at that seam. Okay. So you just put your sleeve in. So what you'll see is you have this seam that goes all the way around, and then if you look on the inside, your back and front should meet just basically at the same point at that seam. And now we're going to pin and stitch the rest of this. This is our side seam. So just from the underarm down to the bottom, go ahead and pin your raw edges together. We're gonna stitch our side seams now. So we've got pinned from the underarm down to the bottom of the garment. And again, just like when you were inserting the sleeve, this part you want to be very precise about. You want to start your stitching right where you left off from the sleeve. So I'm going to line up my 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and take this pin out. And then adjust so that my needle goes down right where that underarm seam finished. Okay. And again, you can carefully backstitch here. I like to hand crank the backstitch because I don't want to stitch up and over into that sleeve. Almost done with this lining part. So next we're just going to be pressing open our seam allowances that we just stitched for the sleeve to body seam and the side seam. So you wanna, I like to start by pressing the side seam. It's just a little bit easier. You can use a seam roll if you like. You wanna press this open. And then when you get to this sleeve body seam, I definitely find that a seam roll is useful for this part. You're gonna again press that seam allowance open. So now you've got your lining, body, and sleeves completed, and we can move on to the main fabric. And we're basically going to be doing the same steps we did with the lining, just on the exterior. So we're going to start with doing the 5/8 inch stay stitch around this back neckline. And I have switched my thread to a light blue to match this fabric, and we're ready to go. The next step is our shoulder seam for the exterior. So I've pinned right side to right side and matched up the double notches near the neckline and the single notch that's further away from the neckline. And I've done that for both of the shoulders. And now we're gonna stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you've readjusted your stitch length to a regular stitch length. I've got mine set at a 3.5. Before you start pressing on this exterior, make sure you've reset your iron settings if you need to. So for my lining, I had set the heat pretty low to synthetic because that was a polyester lining. This is a linen, so I've readjusted to the highest setting here, the cotton linen setting. And you should just test it on your fabric before you press on a scrap of fabric. So I'm going to use a seam roll to press open these shoulder seam allowances. All right, our shoulder seams are pressed now. The next step is to pin your sleeve underarm seams. So again, we're pinning right side to right side. You're gonna fold up and pin the short edge that doesn't have any notches. Okay, we're stitching this sleeve underarm seam. I've got it folded over on itself. Stitching that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Time to press open these underarm seam allowances. This is nice to use a seam roll again, but you don't have to. Just press these open. Okay, we're ready to pin the sleeve to the side of the body. So what you want to do is lay down your body with the right side up, and you want to have your sleeve with the right side out. Okay. And you're going to take your sleeve and find that single notch. I have my single notch here. On the other side is the double notch. I don't want the double notch right now. I want the single notch. And with right sides together, I'm going to line up that single notch on the sleeve with the side seam, the outside of the the outside of the shoulder seam. Okay, not the neckline edge, the outside part. And pin that in place. You want to make sure that as you pin this in place, you're pinning that seam allowance flat, so you don't get any extra bulk when you stitch that seam. And you're going to line up the raw edges here. Now your next landmark is that you have, so this part is my back body. I'm going to find this notch that's about 10 inches down from the shoulder, and that's where I'm going to line up my underarm seam for the sleeve. I'm going to line that right up there. And again, you want to make sure that you're pinning this sleeve underarm seam allowance flat. Okay, and then just pin in between. And then you're going to move on to pinning this front panel to the sleeve. So again, I'm going to find my notch that's about 10 inches down from the shoulder on the front panel. And I'm going to bring that to the underarm seam line and pin that right there. And I'm putting my pins on the sleeve side because I'm going to be sewing this with the sleeve facing up. So I've got that sleeve kind of inserted in there. Okay, so just like we sewed the sleeve in for the lining, we're going to do for the exterior. So we're going to be starting at that sleeve underarm and stitching all the way around back to the sleeve underarm seam. And we're going to be very precise about starting and stopping exactly at that seam. We're going to move right into pinning and stitching the side seam down below the armhole. So you want to match up those underarm notches. Pin right there, and then just pin down your side seam. Okay, we're going to be stitching the side seams now, starting at the underarm notch and working our way to the bottom of the garment. And just like we were very precise when we were stitching that sleeve into the body, we're going to be very precise about where we put our needle in to start. We want to meet up right where we stitched, finished stitching that sleeve, and right at the notches. So I'm going to carefully place my presser foot down, and it's really hard to see my thread on this, sorry. All right, and then you want to carefully do a couple of back stitches. You can hand crank that if you need to. Now we're going to be pressing open that side seam allowance and this sleeve body seam allowance. Again, it's nice to have a seam roll for this step. So you want to be pressing this side seam open, and it's probably good to go ahead and pull that sleeve out. So your whole garment is inside out right now, wrong side out. And we are pressing this side seam allowance open. And then when you get to this sleeve area, again, you're pressing this sleeve body seam allowance open. So you've got your main body, front, back, and sleeves done, and it should lay over your lining because they're basically mirror images of each other. If you want to try that out on a dress form with the wrong sides together, you can do that just to get a feeling for what it's going to be like. The next step is going to be to put together the hem and stitch that onto your jacket. So you want to take your two hem pieces and find that double notched end and match those up, matching the notches right side together. I'm doing my hem in my main fabric, and but you could choose to do it in your contrasting fabric like what you're using for your cuff or your collar if you like. And we're going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to press open this seam allowance. This is our hem center back seam. Okay, we're going to attach the hem to the lining, the bottom of the lining. So, and we're going to attach it right sides together. So here's my lining that I've got constructed. I've got my right side facing up, and I've got my center back notch cut in the bottom of it. You want to find your long side of your hem that does not have notches. So here I have a notch cut for a side seam to match up a side seam. I'm going to put that on the exterior fabric side. So I'm going to go over to this other side that doesn't have notches. And I'm going to line up, again, right side to right side, this hem center back seam with the lining center back notch and pin that in place. Okay, and now you're just gonna work your way out from the center back, pinning this hem all the way along the bottom of the lining until you get to the front edge, and it should line right up. I'm actually gonna cheat and use that notch that I talked about before and go ahead and line it up with the upper part of my side seam, and then the base where that is should line up with the base of the side seam. Make sure you pin this seam allowance flat so it doesn't get caught up when you're stitching it. Okay. So here you can see how that notch lines up with this seam. So that's where I've pinned it in place. And now I'm going to go ahead and pin at the front here. So what I like to do if I have kind of a wide area in between where I need to pin, I go to the middle and pin that in place. And then I divide that in half and pin it in place. And divide that, and so on and so forth. Just so if there's any little bit of ease that needs to be distributed, it gets distributed evenly. Now we're going to stitch this hem to the lining with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. As you approach this side seam, I can tell I'm getting to the side seam because I've got a double pin here. Make sure that this seam allowance is pressed down before you stitch over it. Now we're going to press this hem lining seam allowance away from the lining toward the hem. Make sure that you've set your iron to whatever the lowest setting you need between the two fabrics. So my lining needs a really low setting because it is synthetic. So I've had to turn down my heat on my iron to the synthetic setting so that I don't melt the lining part. So we've gotten our seam allowance here pressed. Now we're going to attach the main jacket body to the hem. So you want to have your hem and lining laying down right side up. I've got my hem running along the top, as you can see. And then you want to put down your jacket body right side down. So our right sides are going to be facing each other, and you're going to find your bottom center back notch on the exterior and line it up with that hem center back seam and pin that in place. Then the next step is to go to your side seam and find that side seam notch on your hem and line that up. And then you're going to line up with this front edge. So my hem has started fraying a little bit, unfortunately. But as I'm just gonna pin from here out. And I'm gonna go back between this center back and side seam and pin in place. And you're gonna do the same for the other side. Stitch with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're gonna press this exterior hem seam allowance away from the body of the jacket and towards the hem. So we're gonna have both of these hem allowances kind of pushed in together towards that hem. I've also adjusted my heat setting on my iron to the highest setting. Since I'm just gonna be pressing on the linen part, I'm gonna be careful not to touch this polyester right now. And press that up into the hem. I'm gonna turn it over and press that same area from the outside. Now I want to press this exterior hem seam like that with my hem up towards the inside of my jacket. So I'm going to kind of finger pinch this, and you want your seam here to be just on the inside of the jacket. You don't want it to be really visible from the outside. The next stitching is going to be that we're going to stitch this hem into place on the exterior of the jacket. And we're going to do what's called stitching in the ditch. So we're going to stitch right where this seam is, or as close as you can get. And then that'll give us a nice even top stitched line on the exterior, about 2 inches from the top. Okay, so what we need to do is pin the hem in place here. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull this sleeve, this lining sleeve through, put it right side out, wrong side out, and put it into the sleeve, the exterior sleeve, because I think everything's just gonna lay more smoothly for this step if we do that. So go ahead and, like I said, turn your lining sleeve inside out and then feed it through your jacket sleeve. And now try to get this as flat as possible. And one thing that you really want to pay attention to here is that you want this seam allowance that attaches the lining to the hem to be down into the hem when you pin this in place. So if you feel like some bulkiness here as you're pinning, you want to go in and check and make sure that this seam allowance is pressed down into the hem, because we don't want that. All right, so I'm just going to pin this in place to get ready to stitch in the ditch. My lining is a little bit tricky to pin on, so I'm going to be pinning on the hem right underneath the lining. I'm going to go to the center back, and I can see how this is kind of poking up. I want to kind of pinch that seam allowance under. All right. And pin that center back in place. And then pin in between the center back and the side seam. Again, get that seam allowance tucked in. So now we're gonna stitch in the ditch, which means we're stitching right where that seam is. And this is not gonna be visible on the inside. The lining is gonna kind of go like this and cover it. So don't stress out if you go a little bit one way or the other onto the lining or the hem. But just do your best to try and stay lined right up with that. And as I stitch, after I take my pins out, I'm going to be kind of pulling these two pieces to the side so that I can really see where I need to get that needle in the ditch. You see, I start pulling here. The key here is to go slow and, like I said, to pull these two pieces apart. Really don't be afraid to go slow as you do this. I'm going to pull my pin out well ahead of time so that I can keep pulling these two sides apart. Okay, I've finished that stitching in the ditch. I feel like I did pretty good getting it in the ditch. There's just a couple of spots where I can kind of see the stitches, but for the most part they're not really visible. And like I said, this lining is going to hang down over that. And what's important is that the stitching looks nice from the exterior. And I would say that it does. It's a pretty even 2 inches from the base of the garment. Pretty even stitches there. I'm just going to press on the exterior of the garment now, just to ease this top stitching. We're getting close. We only have our our cuffs and our collar to do. So what you want to do now is line up your lining shoulder seams here with your exterior shoulder seams. And you're pinning wrong sides together. Pin those in place. Pin them with the seam allowance open. And then from the shoulder seam, work your way down, pinning this lining in place, pinning the front opening of the jacket in place so you have your exterior of your jacket and your lining on the other side. And like I said before, the lining is going to hang down a bit, like fold over into the hem. So just keep working your way down. And then you want to pin it in place with that fold in place too. So then you've got that hanging down. That's going to give us a little bit of ease, like vertical ease when you're wearing the jacket, or whenever who's wearing the jacket is wearing it. And then go ahead and pin this back neckline together at the center back notch and all along this curve. And then you're going to work your way down the other side, the front edge, pinning that in place too. Be basting this front edge of the jacket to the lining all the way around the back neck and down the other front edge. And we're just going to machine baste it. So I'm going to turn my machine to the longest setting here, the longest stitch setting, and baste it just shy of 5/8 of an inch, just inside 5/8 of an inch. We're moving on to the cuff step now. So you're going to take one of your two cuff pieces and fold it over right sides together so that you have your short edges matched up. I don't really have a right and wrong side of this fabric, so it doesn't matter to me, but if you have a right and wrong side, you're gonna pin it right side together. Right along that short edge. These notches here that are about an inch apart are for if you are putting in a contrast fabric trim or ribbon trim, but I'm not doing that with this version of the jacket. I'm going to reset my stitch length to 3.5, and we're going to stitch this cuff seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. You've got your cuff seam sewn. Now you're going to press that seam allowance open. The seam roll is helpful for this. And then turn it back so you've got it wrong side out, inside out. And you want to find this long edge that does not have a notch. So here I've got double notches. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm going to the other side. Find that side. And on this side, we're going to fold in 5/8 of an inch. So I've got my handy dandy ruler set up with my stop at 5/8 of an inch. And I'm just gonna go around the entire unnotched long edge, pressing in 5/8 of an inch. We're going to be attaching the cuff to the sleeve now. So for this, you've already got your lining inside your exterior jacket, right? You're going to grab your lining and your exterior and pull the sleeve inside out. So now you've got this sleeve tube that's got your lining on the outside and your exterior fabric on the inside, okay? The lining should be right side facing out. Now you want to take your cuff and turn it so it's also right side facing out. And you're going to be sliding this in to the sleeve with this raw side facing out. So you're going to be matching up this cuff seam with the lining and exterior underarm seam. And so you're going to have 3 layers here that you want to match up the raw edges for right at that seam and pin in place. Okay, now you kind of tuck this rest of this cuff in here. So the cuff is hanging out inside the sleeve. Now the other thing you're going to be matching up is these double notches. You've got your double notches on your cuff and your double notches on your lining and your exterior. We want all those to line up. If you prefer, you could baste your lining to your sleeve first before doing this step, but I don't really think it's necessary. Just make sure that all your raw edges are lining up. So you've got these 2 landmarks pinned. Now you're going to pin everything in between and line up all those raw edges for your 3 layers. All right, we're ready to stitch our cuff on the first seam. I'm gonna remove that extra part of my sewing machine base so that I can slide the sleeve onto that arm. And take one of your sleeves, make sure your needle is up. And we're going to, I'm gonna start right at this seam, right in the middle, and we're going to stitch this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to be pressing this cuff seam allowance. So you want to pull your cuff out from inside that sleeve. You've still got your sleeve inside out and your cuff is now inside out as well. And we're going to be pressing these seam allowances toward the cuff away from the body of the jacket. It's helpful to have a seam roll for this, and remember to turn down your heat on your iron to the correct level for your lining if necessary. And as I iron, I'm pulling out on this cuff to pull it away from that seam allowance. And you can turn that whole thing right side out now and press it from the outside as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn my heat up on my iron and add some steam since I'm not ironing directly onto that polyester lining right now. That way I can really steam out this seam allowance. See this seam, I mean. Now you want to turn that back inside out. And we're going to fold this cuff in half. And you want to be bringing that pressed folded edge of your cuff just over this seam where you attach the cuff to the lining and the jacket. So just past it, like 1/16 of an inch past it, so that you're covering that seam, and pin it in place. Now, so we've pinned it on the inside. I actually prefer to sew it with the exterior of the garment showing though, because then you can really control where your stitch line is. So what we're gonna do is we're going to, now that we've got it pinned on the inside, we're gonna turn it right side out. And between those pins that we did on the inside, we're gonna pin on the outside, and then after this step we'll take out those original pins. Okay, so we've got it pinned on the outside now. Now I'm going to go in and take out those interior pins. It should be pinned just how we want it now. Now we've got it pinned on the outside, but we know that it's covering our interior seam just how we want it. We're ready to top stitch this cuff. And I just switched my thread and bobbin back to this tan because I'm going to be stitching on my cuff fabric, which is a tan. So just be mindful of that, and if you need to switch your thread color, go ahead and do that now. And I still have my part of my base removed from the sewing machine so that I can slide this cuff and sleeve over the base of the sewing machine. And I'm going to be stitching with about 1/8 of an inch inside this seam line. So I'm lining up this seam with the interior of my needle opening on my presser foot. Okay. Okay. And I'm just going to go all the way around. We are on the last step, which is to put your collar onto your jacket. So you're going to take your two collar pieces and you're going to find these double notches close to each other and line them up on the two collar pieces, right sides together. Or if your fabric is like mine and it doesn't have a right or wrong side, just line those notches up. Okay, and then we're done with the sleeve, so we can put this base back on. And you're going to stitch this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to press open that collar seam allowance. And then we are going to press under the long unnotched edge of your collar piece. So I have a shoulder notch here and here. That's not the side that we're going to press under. We're going to press under the other side that does not have any notches. We're going to press it under 5/8 of an inch, just like we did with the cuff. You can use your ruler. And you're going to continue to press under along the entire long edge. Time to attach this collar piece to your garment. So you want to have your jacket right side up. This is the back. I've got my back curved neckline here. And you're going to find that center back notch and line it up with the raw edge and the center back seam of the collar. And you've already basted your lining to the exterior, so that should also be lined up. And you just want to pin that in place. Next, you want to find that shoulder seam right here, and you're going to line that up with this notch. Put a couple of pins on either side of that notch. Okay, then we can just go down the rest of this front panel. We'll go back and sort out this back neckline afterwards. But for now, I'm gonna start pinning this down the front panel. Again, we're pinning right side to right side. And you have 3 layers. You've got your collar, your exterior, and your lining. And you're gonna have extra down at the bottom. It should be about 5/8 of an inch extra. This looks like a little bit more, but that's okay. We can sort that out. But you wanna have at least 5/8 of an inch extra at the bottom. Okay, let's go back and do the back neck curve. Now what you want to do is where this curve is, we're going to clip right up to that stay stitching through both layers, the exterior and the lining. So I'm going to do 4 or 5 clips along that curved area, okay? Now the straight area next to that, I can just go ahead and pin, no problem. Pin the collar on. I think I need to do 1 more clip here. Okay. And now since you've clipped that curve, you should be able to line this up. It should release and fit onto that straight collar. Let's fix this pin because it's pinning that lining snip. Okay. Do 1 more pin. Okay, so I've got that all pinned. I have about 6 pins in that really small curved area. So you're gonna need to put a lot of pins right there, okay? Then you're gonna do the same thing for this whole side too. Now we're gonna stitch the collar to the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And we have extra collar at the end. That's what we're supposed to have, at least 5/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna start up here where my garment actually starts. Now we're going to press this seam allowance towards the collar, away from the garment. Make sure you turn down the heat on your iron to whatever temperature your lining needs. And as you press, pull the collar away from the seam. Now we're going to press this again on the exterior. I've turned up my heat on my iron, and you want to make sure you can feel that the seam allowances are towards the collar as you go. Just press that collar away from the seam. Okay, now we're going to deal with the bottom of the collar, the part that extends past. So you're going to be folding this collar right side against right side and matching up your folded edge with that seam where you connected the collar to the garment. And then you also want to match up this raw edge at the bottom and just pin your collar right there at that intersection. Right here, just above where this bottom of the garment is, okay? Now what we want to do, actually I'm gonna turn my pin this way. What we want to do is we want to sew a seam line that just continues this line that is the bottom of the garment. So what I'm going to do is I want my stitch line to end right here where the bottom of the garment is, right there. Okay, so I've marked that. And then I also want this stitch line to be at a right angle to the long edge of the collar. So I'm going to line up my straight edge with this folded edge of this collar here and with my marking at the base of the garment. And I'm going to draw a stitch line. Okay, and that's where I'm going to stitch. That's going to give me a correct base for my collar. I'm going to follow that stitch line that I drew in chalk. I'm going to plant my needle where my line begins. Okay, now we're going to trim this seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch here. And then trim off these corners here, right up against the seam, but not cutting into the seam, of course. Okay, that's what that's gonna look like. Now we take this collar and we're gonna turn it right side out. You can poke with your finger to get that corner out, and then if you need to, you can also use a closed pair of scissors to gently poke that corner out. And then you're going to pin this folded edge of your collar over onto the inside of your garment, just covering that seam line where your collar connected to your garment to begin with. And this is very similar to how we did the cuff. It's the same idea. And again, you're just moving this folded edge about 1/16 of an inch past that seam line. And you want to just go all the way around your garment, pinning. Okay, we've got this pinned on the inside. Now we're going to do the same thing we did with the cuff, where we actually go back and pin on the outside and then take out the interior pins. So I'm just going to go in between these pins. I am going to do one pin right at the base here. That's pretty important. This way we can stitch with the exterior of the garment facing up and really control the look of that stitch line as we top stitch this collar. Okay, I've got it pinned on the exterior. Now I'm going to go back and take out these interior pins. Okay, so I just have my exterior pins now. Same as we did with the cuff, we're going to be top stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from where this seam is that connects the collar to the garment. So I'm going to line up this seam with the inside of this opening for my needle on my presser foot. I'm going to go ahead and bury my needle and then take this first pin out and do a little bit of back stitching. You are all done with your stitching. The last bit is just to press this collar to ease that top stitching and give a nice crisp edge to that collar. And on the interior, you can see that we've covered that stitching. Let's do the same, pressing that crease on the cuff here. You can find this and my other patterns on Atelier Joy on Etsy. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Thanks for watching.